One, I've been to your church several times, but I've never actually attended a service here. So it's great to actually be with you when there's other people here and not just other pastors from Mountain States. So as Mill said, my name is Zach Martinez. I'm a former pastor of Sojourn Mennonite Church up in Fort Collins and Greeley, but now I spend my days as a hospice chaplain in the northern Colorado area. And so today I wanted to share a little bit with you about one of my favorite topics as a hospice chaplain, which is the topic of hope. I know that doesn't exactly sound like something a hospice chaplain would think about all that often, but hope is probably the theological concept that is most important to me and something that I meditate on quite a lot. But today I want to focus a little bit more on the question of hope and the church. More specifically, the question of whether or not there is hope for the church in the coming century. And the reason I want to start here today is because I read an article a few years back, it was actually in 2017, that kind of shook me to my core and made me question all of my career choices as an early pastor. And it was a report in the Washington Post, and it said that based on current trends in decline, attendance and affiliation with mainline Protestant churches would be effectively zero by the year 2039. Let me say that again. This report showed that based on current trends in decline, attendance and affiliation with Protestant mainline churches would be effectively zero by the year 2039. That's only 16 years away. Now that study, of course, is a little old, but I haven't read anything since that would suggest the trends have reversed. In fact, I have a suspicion that the pandemic has probably hastened that decline. I also want to say, I know that Mennonites are pretty uncomfortable being compared with mainline Protestants, or evangelical Protestants for that matter. We'd like to think of ourselves as something distinct entirely. And that's fine from a theological perspective, but my guess is that from a socio-cultural perspective, we probably match those trends in decline pretty closely. And if we were to look across Mountain States, my guess, this is anecdotal, but my guess is that our trends in affiliation and attendance are probably resembling those more of the mainline churches than those of the evangelical churches. And this means that we have a problem on our hands. So I have an idea of how to sort of get people to fully understand the situation we're facing. I think we should start with a movie, similar to the movie 2012. Do you remember this movie, 2012? It starred John Cusack. Series of climate disasters bring society to its knees. I think we should do a similar movie for churches based on the year 2039. I can imagine the trailer, right? You can probably too. We can see empty church sanctuaries and decaying church facilities. And maybe the tagline could be like a riff off of that old rhyme we learned as kids, like, here is the church, here is the steeple, but where are all the people? Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I stole that line from a seminar I attended at MennoCon in Kansas City a few years ago. But that was a seminar title, and that the fact that that was a seminar title should tell us something about how people are feeling in the Mennonite church. And perhaps you all are beginning to feel or have similar kinds of questions as you look around your own church. Maybe as you look around, you realize that there aren't as many people in the sanctuary as there used to be. Or perhaps you're wondering, where have all the programs gone? Or maybe you're wondering, why is the youth group smaller than it was when I was in the youth group? And so if that's where you're at, I just want to let you know you're not alone. There are many people who are asking this question and wondering about this. And for those of us for whom church is extremely important, this can be an extremely worrying and disorienting feeling. And it inspired this question that I was asked all the time when I was a pastor. Is there hope for the future of the church? How many of you all have wondered this question? Is there hope for the future of the church? Well, I do have good news for you today, but I also have bad news. The good news is that I feel like there's plenty of reason for hope. I just think I look across our world, I look across our conference, look across our denomination, and there is plenty of reason to hope. But the bad news is that hope isn't a guarantee that things are going to turn out the way you want them to. Hope is not a guarantee that things are going to turn out the way you want them to. Instead, hope is looking forward to a future that isn't currently known to us, because we believe in a God that is at work in our world, even in the face of adversity. Paul talks about hope like this. He talks about hope in his letter to the Romans. In chapter 8, Paul says this: "Hope that is seen is not hope. For who hopes for what is seen? We hope for what is not seen, and we wait for it with patience." So in other words, hope isn't really hope if you know exactly what you're hoping for. And I think this is important to make this point really clear, because when we talk about hope, I think we often start on the exact wrong foot, especially when we're talking about hope for the church. Because when we talk about hope for the future of the church, many of us have an image in our mind about what that church will be, what we're hoping for. And it's often drawn from images of what the church once was. Often when we talk about hope for the future of the church, whether or not we have hope is synonymous with coming to the conclusion that the church will return to its former glory. So when we say, is there hope for the future of the church? What we're really asking is the sanctuary going to be full again? What we're really asking is, are we going to have the same kind of programming we used to? Or is the youth group going to grow, right? That's what we actually mean when we say, is there hope for the future of the church? But that's not hope. That's nostalgia. And nostalgia is the calamitous antithesis to hope. Just look at certain politicians who like to draw on images of the past. It's not usually a hopeful message. Nostalgia gives us this clear picture of the way we think things should be, and it's basically trying to invite us to create the future in the image of the past. It resists change and growth. And so while hope is dynamic and fluid, nostalgia is static and solid. And this dichotomy between hope and nostalgia, I think, is at the heart of prophetic thinking. So this prophet Jeremiah, he was active at a time when nostalgia was ruling ideology in Judah. The kings of Judah in the 7th and 8th century BCE had become convinced of their own invincibility because they believed that their God would forever maintain their power in the land. And so these kings became decadent, and they oppressed their people, and they waged wars of conquest. And they had this singular vision of how God intended to act, which was that God would always act in ways that benefited the regime. This was, after all, how they believed God acted in the past. In the centuries prior to Jeremiah's ministry, God had kept this regime in power, even in the face of great adversity. Even when Assyria invaded the land, laid waste to the north, and besieged Jerusalem, Assyria was never able to dethrone the kings of Judah. And so by Jeremiah's time, the kings of Judah believed that this was God's modus operandi, that they could wage their wars of conquest, that they could oppress their people, and God would keep them safe. But Jeremiah and other prophets like him knew that God has very little interest in maintaining oppressive, violent regimes. And so Jeremiah's charge, which is something we learned earlier in the book, his charge is one of warning. This kind of oppressive violence leads to disaster. And if the kings of Judah don't change their ways, then they will incur the wrath of empires like Egypt and Babylon. God's warning to the kings of Judah is similar to that old adage that those who live by the sword die by the sword. Or we could put it more precisely and say that those who promote violence and oppression will bring violence and oppression on themselves. And so this word of God comes to Jeremiah that Israel and like Judah, they're like clay in a potter's hand. And as the potter begins to craft this vessel, if he notices that it's beginning to spoil, that potter will reshape it, will take steps to make it into something else. And so it is with Judah, God says to Jeremiah, because God had begun to craft this tiny nation and its kings began to spoil it. And so God would need to do some reworking. And in Jeremiah's day, this reworking of that vessel came in the form of the Babylonian exile. The prophetic witness suggests to us that in order for God to bring new shape to the people of Judah, God would have to take them from their land and move them into exile. And that's actually the ultimate message of Jeremiah, that Babylon was going to come into the land of Judah and cleanse it of its wickedness and carry the people off into a distant land to live in exile. Now that sounds pretty bleak, but for Jeremiah, it was a message of hope. It was actually this message that said that this would undo the oppressive regimes and make way for something new. This was how God was going to rework the vessel. And nostalgia has no way to comprehend this metaphor. Nostalgia does everything in its power to save that original vessel, even as its walls are collapsing in and caving. And that's exactly what the kings of Judah did. They fought tooth and nail to maintain their power in the region, and it ended in disaster. Hope, on the other hand, understands the malleability of clay. It knows that it can be reworked into something new in the hands of an expert potter. And so Jeremiah actually invites the people to go willingly into exile, to stop their fight against Babylon, and to go off so that they can be reworked. Now, I just want to pause here for a quick second and say that the particulars of Jeremiah's message are extremely unsettling, and just invite us to remember that this is a writer writing in the 8th century BCE. Because what Jeremiah is essentially saying is that God ordained Babylon to come in and destroy Jerusalem, to drag the people into slavery in a foreign land, all as a kind of communal penance. That is a troubling image, to be sure. We know all too well what wars of conquest look like. And there are other voices in Scripture that complain about this project. Habakkuk, for example, receives the same message that Jeremiah does, and Habakkuk says that is unacceptable. So this is an admittedly problematic text, but it does give us a better picture of what hope is supposed to look like. Hope doesn't cling to the old, spoiled vessel. It recognizes the possibility of something new. And so today, I believe we are coming to a point in history where the church, the current vessel, is beginning to spoil. That apocalyptic year of 2039 looms over us. It's coming quicker than we think. When I did the math in my head after reading that original story 5 years ago and realized that it is now only 16 years away, I was pretty shocked. But we're left with a question: where do we go from here? And as I said earlier, I really do think that we have reason to hope. But does that mean that I have reason to think that our sanctuaries are going to be as full as they once were? I don't know. Does that mean that I have reason to think that church programs are going to be as robust as they once were? I don't know. Does that mean that our youth groups are going to grow? No, I don't. I don't think that. But I do have hope. And the reason I have hope is that the church, as has come to be understood in the last couple hundred years or so, is coming undone. And that might not be a bad thing. God's obviously not raising up a Babylonian army to sack our cities and burn our churches, but perhaps God is raising up generations of people who are fed up with racism and misogyny and homophobia and abuse. And until the church in the United States deals with the fact that it has historically benefited from and perpetuated racism and misogyny and homophobia and abuse, well, then the church is doomed to a waning cultural influence. Perhaps it's the case that God isn't raising up Babylon to come cleanse us of our wickedness, but maybe God is raising up generations of people who care deeply about the suffering of the world's poor and vulnerable until the church concerns itself with the plight of those in this life as much as it concerns itself with the plight of those in the next life. Then the church will continue to decline until no one notices when it's gone. Perhaps it's the case that as our younger folks watch our world literally and figuratively burning, that they will not put up with the old institutions that allowed that to become possible. Now you might be thinking to yourself, is he sure he's got hope? Is he sure that this is a hopeful message? I am sure this is a hopeful message. But remember what I said earlier, hope isn't a guarantee that things are going to turn out the way we want them to. I have hope because I see the way clearing for something new. And I believe in a God that can breathe new life into the old dry bones of what was left in the past. I have hope for something new because we need something new. I truly believe that. And so I want to leave you with this image of hope from 2nd Isaiah, who is, roughly speaking, a late contemporary of Jeremiah. He has this similar observation to what Jeremiah offered and what I believe our hope should be. This comes from Isaiah chapter 43. Isaiah writes, "Don't remember the former things or consider the things of old. I am about to do a new thing, and now it springs forth. Do you perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert." May that be a message of hope to us as well.